Very pleased to be able to come here for a number of reasons. One, Brazil probably is one of the very few countries in the world which have an association like this, Brazilian Association of Political Economy. The only other country I know is Japan. Japan has Japan Association of Political Economy. Britain doesn't have, India doesn't have, maybe some other country have, but I don't know about it. In Britain we have something like Association of Heterodox Economics, which is again not political economy, because the Association of Heterodox Economics recognizes neoclassical economics, and that is deliberate, so that neoclassical economists are not alienated and they engage with us, but they really don't engage actually. And so as you can compromise, we don't call it Association of Political Economists. So I admire your initiative that you have an association of political economy which stands in parallel with the dominant paradigm economics of the neoclassical economics. There are good things in neoclassical neoliberal economics which need to be valued, but we also need to engage with them in a very, very critical fashion, because there are serious problems with that analysis. I'm also pleased because I'm coming to Brazil, and I have had many students from Brazil. I kind of knew about them, but it is basically when I met Naima and Vanessa at the World Association of Political Economy that I started coming to Latin America. Of course, my first visit to Latin America was organized by my friend Pedro, who is sitting here, and whom also I admire, and so it's a good opportunity to meet these friends. And I'm a great admirer of Latin America right now, because I think politically and intellectually Latin America is the most advanced region in the world at the moment. If you look at the debates which are going around on the question of future of the world changing, question of environment, question of eco-socialism, popular movements, tribal movements, land reforms, issues of alternative financial architecture. You are the most advanced region in the world. You should be proud of this, and I'm happy to be coming here and speaking to you. So that's my way of conveying thanks and pleasure about coming here. As Naima has explained, my today's presentation would be divided into two parts. First, I'm going to talk about BRICS, and BRICS, as you know, starts with Brazil, so that's very good. And the first, the first is for Brazil, and it of course has India into it and other developing countries. So I'm going to talk about the rise of the BRICS. And the rise of the BRICS can be explained in many ways, but I'm going to take eco-socialism perspective. And after the break, I'm going to, at his suggestion, taking up India's political economic development, and again giving my eco-socialist perspective. So coming back to the BRICS, the importance of the rise of BRICS and eco-socialist perspective. The rise of the BRICS can be understood in many ways. It can be understood in terms of changing the balance, political balance, the development of countries which were earlier underdeveloped, like the newly industrializing countries had another experience. It can be understood as a manifestation of uneven and combined development. There are various ways, but I have to take one particular angle to understand and to emphasize the rise of BRICS, which is from its implications for sustainability and eco-socialist conclusions which emerge from the sustainability implications from the rise of the BRICS economy. Next, yes. So this is the main kind of program of the first lecture. The meaning of the rising importance of the global economy, or what I have called the spatial shift taking place in the global economy, because it's a spatial shift taken away from West to what was earlier considered the developing part of the world. Then I'm going to provide evidence of that shift, because one can say, okay, you are saying shift, but how do you prove this, that shift is taking place? And so I will have a considerable part of the lecture would be on providing evidence of the shift. Then I'm going to obviously link up at the sustainability implications. There are many implications. There are military implications, there are political implications, governance implications, but I'm going to focus more on the sustainability implications. And out of that, I'm going to drive my message for eco-socialism. So that's the program of the lecture. So starting with the meaning of the shift. It can be put in three simple terms. One, that there's a shift in power balance in global capitalism. And this power balance is economic, political, and I would say to some extent cultural and psychological. It is very interesting when in China and India are being talked about. I came to Britain about 25 years ago, and no one bothered about India and China. But in the last 5-10 years, every department, economics, political science, sociology, they're interested in India and China. So there is a kind of psychological shift which is taking place in the mind of people. The West is not dominant anymore, which doesn't mean that it isn't important. It is pretty dominant, but that change is taking place. So there is this global power balance and a change which is taking place in the power balance, and which has mainly two dimensions. One, the decline of formerly dominant economic powers in global capitalism, which is USA, Europe, Japan, to name three others. And then the rise of the BRICS. S has been included into this recently. In 2011, South Africa has been added. But my analysis for the moment is BRIC economy. I might add here that I'm taking BRIC only as an example of the shift which is taking place. One could take other countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, Vietnam, Philippines. They're also part of the same process which is taking place. And like BRICS, there is another terminology called MIST, which is Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, and Turkey. So BRICS is only an example of that shift. The emphasis is not so much on BRICS specifically, but BRICS as an example of the shift which is taking place. Okay, next. So we start with the shift. That the upper part shows the decline in the share of the GDP of four dominant economic powers over the last about 30 years. I could not collect data before that. Yeah, that's better. That's better. So it might be actually interesting to see the shift over a longer period of time. But I was able to access data at 30 years time, and it's very interesting that USA share in the GDP actually has declined from 22.6, and we will see later on that in fact it has gone up more than 22.6. It had gone almost 1/4 of the GDP. It has gone down to 18.5. Similarly, UK has declined, Germany has declined, Japan has declined. So that's one dimension, that the decline of the share of the GDP of the old dominant economic power. 30-year period, there has been decline. And on the other hand, the rise. Though this rise is not consistent. We are taking just 4 countries. Brazil, in fact, shows slight decline. But in this decline, there are ups and downs. And Russia shows decline. Russian data is obviously after the disintegration of the Soviet Union from 1989. India and China are obviously remarkable, especially China. India is also interesting that it's almost doubled. India's share in the global GDP has doubled. But China is the most remarkable, that from 2% in 1980 of the GDP, it has gone to 14%. So this is the shift, that old have declined, new are emerging. Okay. This is same data, but put it in a different way. The upper part, the green part, shows the decline of the share of the GDP of the advanced countries. The lower green part shows the rise of the GDP of these 4 powers. Now, Germany is a consistent increase, but more remarkably since 1990s. Partly it is because when East Germany joined West Germany, and there's a consistent decline. So from 6.9 in 1980, 2011, it's almost half. Japan, again, 8.12, so it has gone to 5.8, and it was as high as 9.30. 1990 is the kind of starting point. UK considerably declined. It has also gone considerably to 3.81. And USA is obviously the most remarkable. If you look at 2000, it was 23.3, so almost 24%. 1/4 of the entire GDP of the world was in US. It has declined to 18.6. Looking at Brazil, we can say there are shifts which are taking place, ups and downs, but it has actually declined a bit, and partly it is because of the way other countries have risen. China, obviously, as I said earlier, is most remarkable. Consistent increase during this period, and going up to 14% of the GDP by 2011. India more than doubled its share, almost 3 times, and Russia ups and downs, but has increased comparison with 1995. So it's the same kind of data, but put it in a different way. Yeah. This is only a diagrammatic representation. You can say that this is the decline of the old countries. The graph shows decline for almost all of them, all the advanced countries. Next. This is the evidence of shift for the developing countries, and the red line is particularly very interesting, which shows China. Sharp increase, from 1982% to 14%. But also, of course, increase for other BRICS countries as well. Next. This is on the rate of growth. Another way of looking at this shift. From 1980 to 2011, I had data actually for each of these years, but I put them into after every five years. So 1980, 85, 1990, and finally 2011 is the latest one. And it shows that it had a fairly low rate of growth. If you look at the red part, which is the advanced countries, and very significant rates of growth in the lower part, which is the BRICS economies. And in fact, in the case of Japan, it is negative economic growth at the end, and it has been consistently declining. And in the case of the lower green part, I mean, it's amazing that China in 1985 had 13.50% rate of growth, unparalleled in the history of the world. There is no example where there has been such high rate of economic growth. Even India in 2005 had 9.28%, which is very, very high rates of growth. So very, very impressive rates of growth, especially China and India, and obviously, especially China as a result of that. Next. This is a diagrammatic representation of the same, of the rate of growth, which shows ups and downs, but generally a downward shift for the advanced countries. Next. This is again a diagrammatic representation of the improvement in the rate of growth in the developing countries or the BRICS economies. So the same data being represented in a diagrammatic form. Now this is very interesting. Here I am putting the data on per capita income, and this one can say is a counterexample of what I have been saying, but not truly, because this is important when we come to the sustainability implications. The upper part obviously shows the rich advanced countries, and the lower part, green part, shows the BRICS economies. Now, though the rate of growth has been declining in the advanced countries, but if you look at per capita income, consistently it has been rising for all the countries. And as you can see, there's a huge difference if you look at the final figure, 2011, huge difference in the per capita income. I mean, India is as low as less than $4,000. Brazil is still reasonably good, and Russia is reasonably good. But obviously China is most remarkable in terms of the increase from 250 US dollars to go up to almost 9,000. It's a phenomenal increase. So it's very interesting that though the share of advanced countries in the global GDP has declined, but their per capita income still remains very high. And we will come to see this, that there has been an increase in per capita income, but still there are huge pockets of poverty in these countries. India especially, but even in China, there are huge pockets of poverty, of course also in Brazil, but India and China are especially remarkable. And when growth takes place in those countries, what are its implications for sustainability? That is something we will come to later on. Okay, next. This is again a diagrammatic representation of the rising per capita income. So it's very interesting that even when there has been a slow rate of growth, per capita income has been still rising. Partly it is to do with demographic features. And in countries like Germany, population growth rate has been very, very low. And that also explains why, despite the slow rate of growth, per capita income has been rising. But at the same time, it is true that even with slow rate of growth, per capita income has been rising. Not rising as high as it has done in the earlier period, but still there is a consistent rise in per capita income. And this is the developing countries, the per capita income. And obviously the most remarkable is Russia. Russia's per capita income has shot up very significantly. And though the rate of in India and China has been high, but per capita income hasn't really touched very high still because of huge population, especially in the case of India, that despite the significantly impressive rates of growth, per capita income is still low. China has done better, partly because the one-child policy which has been adopted right from the 1970s, late 1970s, 78, and it has shown a better rise in per capita income. Okay. I also looked at, because someone might say that the GDP is not the only criteria to look at the share of a country in the global political economy. So I gave the data on per capita income. But it's important to recognize, before I go on to the foreign direct investment, it's important to recognize that a country might have high per capita income, but when it comes to weight in the global economy, it is the gross GDP which is more important. Let me give you an example of, say, Denmark and India. Okay? The per capita income of India is significantly lower than Denmark. Denmark has very high per capita income, maybe 20 times more than India. But Denmark is a small country. Its gross GDP is very small. So India's per capita income is low because the country is so big. Its gross GDP is so high that it's become the third most important country in the world in terms of gross GDP. And it's the gross GDP which determines the economic power of the country. Because if they have to take big economic projects, it's the gross GDP which determines that, not the per capita income. Per capita income tells you about the standard of living, average standard of living. But the economic weight of a country is determined by the gross GDP. So that was important what I did before. But I also looked at the foreign direct investment and foreign trade. And I haven't given in this presentation data on foreign trade, but something on foreign direct investment is very, very interesting. I looked at one study which did not take only the BRICS economies, but took other developing countries and about 18 countries. This was by J.P. Morgan. And it showed very interestingly that 90% of the world's total FDI inflows between the period of 1990 to 95 were in these countries, the developing countries. So where is the foreign direct investment going? And this is a significant change. If one looks at the data of the 1960s, the foreign direct investment is mainly concentrated in Europe and America. They are the ones who are exchanging foreign direct investment. So there is a considerable shift which is taking place, not only in GDP but also in foreign direct investment. And the last line is very interesting, that the foreign direct investment inflows of the emerging economies surpassed those of the developed economies in 2010 for the first time in history. That, for the first time in that about 4 years back, the total foreign direct investment inflows are more than they were in the developed countries. So another indication of the shift. I had data on foreign trade also, but it wasn't very clear. So I mean, it was very messy, and I chose not to represent it. But that also indicates that the overall conclusions from trends in foreign trade is also that there is a shift taking place. So the point which I'm trying to make is that whether you look at GDP, whether you look at foreign direct investment, or you look at foreign trade, there is a shift taking place in the global economy. Okay, one can go into the theoretical causes of this. There are various explanations. I prefer the law of uneven development, law of uneven and combined development as an example, and to that extent, it is also an indirect criticism of the dependency theories. I know Pedro Prebli, the defender of dependency theories. Dependency theories had a huge contribution to make in terms of development economics. Because when the dependency theories came into being, before that, development economics was taught mainly in terms of internal mechanism of development. That why a country is developed or underdeveloped, it was mainly explained through internal mechanisms. Dependency theory shifted that focus to external dimensions. That why a country is underdeveloped, it is because of the external determinants, because of colonialism, because of imperialism. So to that extent, it had a huge contribution to make. But obviously, a very serious dent was made in the dependency theories with the rise of NIC in the 1960s, which was captured by a number of people. There was a very important book written on imperialism and the harbinger of capitalism. But I think that the same phenomena, in a more dramatic fashion, is being shown by the rise of the BRICS economy. Because NIC countries were small, 4 countries, that is Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. They were relatively small, except South Korea. All the other countries are small. Singapore is only a city-state, and Hong Kong is also almost a city. And so one could say that, okay, that's not a huge kind of rejection or criticism of the dependency theory. But this one tells you something else. So the point is that something is happening in global capitalism, which has led to the rise of such a substantial part of the world, which are not small countries, they are very, very big countries, as we will see subsequently, and the implications of that change. Okay. Now, a few other figures to again tell you about the evidence of shift. In 2010, China replaced US as the biggest manufacturer in the world. That was very interesting, very recently, and replaced Japan as the second largest economy in the world. And India replaced Japan as the third largest economy in 2011. And China's GDP is likely to overtake US by 2014 now. So right now, USA is the biggest economy in the world. China is the second biggest. India is the third biggest. And Japan is now relegated to 4th place. And which is very interesting. Just a few years back, USA was the first, and then Japan was the second, and then China, and then other countries came. India and China have replaced that second order. And I had data about the top 10 countries. In the top 10 countries, the developing countries have come very prominently. And the interesting thing is that many studies on the BRICS economy earlier suggested that it will probably take about 10 years for China to become the most dominant economy in terms of GDP. But the most recent data which has come up is that by the end of 2014, China is going to overtake USA as the country with the biggest GDP. So that's another demonstration. Just below that, emerging economy share of whole GDP 55% by 2018. That's IMF data. That not many, just in 4 years' time, not only the BRICS but emerging economies as a whole, they will constitute the major part of the world economy. They will constitute the major part of the GDP, not the advanced countries anymore. And few other things. China is now the world's largest exporter, second largest importer, holding world's largest trade and current account surpluses. I mean, in a way, fate of America is in the hands of China now, because it has the largest currency reserves, and holding the world's largest flow of savings, largest importer of many commodities, and a price setter. Martin Wolf of the Financial Times has emphasized that China is in a position like a monopolist now, that it can actually, it's a price setter because it's the largest importer of many commodities. It can dictate. And the last part says that if the current growth rate persists, and then by 2050, and I have a feeling that it might be even earlier than that, it's estimated that China would be the dominant global supplier of manufactured goods, India would be the dominant global supplier of services, and Russia and Brazil would be the principal global suppliers of raw materials. Russia on gas and so on and so forth, and Brazil on many agricultural commodities. And this is discussed in one paper of mine, another in a book. Okay? Okay, so to come to sustainability implications. One is very clear, that the rise of income which is taking place in the BRICS economies, that's also leading to rise in consumption. Okay? I have visited China, I have visited South Africa, and I visit India quite often, and of course I'm visiting Brazil. I'm not able to compare Brazil, China, and South Africa with what was about 10-15 years before, but in India I can see the entire dynamic of life is changing. 20 years back, 25 years back, very few people had cars, very few houses had air conditioning. But there's a mushrooming growth. The number of cars which fly in on Delhi and other big cities, the number of houses, and some of the houses are so palatial. It's unimaginable. Now, obviously, this rise in income is not uniform. It's concentrated in a section of the population which we call the new middle class. But this middle class is very, very substantial. So there is a rise in consumption, and a rise in consumption has important implications in terms of demand of resources. And along with this rise in consumption is the change in consumption patterns. And from an environmental point of view, one thing that I would like to mention is the change in consumption patterns in China. The demand for non-vegetarian food in China has really shot up very much. It has increased in India also, but India not dramatically, partly because of cultural reasons, that the Hindu religion is about 80% of the India's population, and considerable number of Hindus, not all Hindus, but considerable number of Hindus do not consume meat, they are vegetarians. So therefore the rise in income in India has not similarly expressed in the rise in demand for non-vegetarian food and meat products. But in China it has gone up very high. And if you look at the world as a whole, the demand for meat products in the developing world is many times higher than the demand for meat in the developed countries. Now that has implications in terms of using land. Land is increasingly being allocated to growing cattle, which is then used for meat consumption. And as a result of that, the total area of land under cultivation for food crops has grown. So one of the causes of the food crisis, the rise in food prices, is this. There are many other things as well. Sorry. But one of them is this, that there's a shift in land pattern use, that a considerable part of the land is being used for cattle, so that is also important. As a result of increasing population, and that population having seen rise in income and rise in demand, there is a very intense competition for resources. India and China are locked up in a huge competition for buying land. I have another paper, written a paper on the global food crisis, given data on the land which is being bought by India and China in Africa, and even in Latin America, parts of Latin America, and the former Soviet Union. Thousands and thousands of acres of land are being bought by India and China in Africa. A new kind of imperialism is emerging, which is basically to grow food for their own population. Okay? Similarly for gas and other resources, oil resources. India and China are competing with each other because they need to meet this demand for these resources. And as environmental economics teaches us, that any demand for resource is simultaneously a creation, an opportunity to create waste. If you look at this hall, we can count maybe 100 products, or more than maybe 100 products. Each of these products is going to become waste. The life or life cycle of each product differs. Maybe this pair of specs might become waste in 10 years' time. This water bottle, some of the water bottles takes 1,000 years to biodegrade. Therefore, this water bottle is quite a pernicious thing. And if one can avoid water bottle, one should avoid. This building probably will become waste in 300 years. Everything is become waste. And when everything becomes waste, it is a pressure on the environment. Because what happens to waste? Waste has to be absorbed. The environment has been absorbing this waste for centuries, but there was no pollution. Because the level of waste was not higher than the capacity of the environment to absorb waste. The environment absorbed this waste through land. We have landfills. We throw waste in water. We have emissions which are thrown into the air. So what is pollution? Pollution is when the level of waste generated is higher than the rate of absorption of that waste by the environment. Technically then becomes waste. So this increasing income accompanied by increasing consumption is leading to increasing demand for resources, and each demand for resources then is becoming a waste, and that waste is leading to pollution and gas emissions. And that's what is eventually working into global warming. But global warming does not sit just idle. Pollution does not just sit idle. They are going to interact back from this. That when the water is polluted, it's not good enough for irrigation, it's not good for consumption. Similarly, when land is polluted, land is not good enough for cultivation, it cannot generate food. So they reinforce each other's crisis. So the main point which I'm trying to argue from this is that the rising power of the BRICS economy is accompanied by rising income, rising in consumption, and rising in waste, and waste leading to pollution and global warming. Next. Okay, now how does one look at from an eco-socialist perspective on that? There are various things, but I'll try to capture some of the most important things. One, this is my understanding, that the traditional Western model of development cannot be duplicated anymore. Because before this, one could say that capitalism goes through uneven development, that in the 19th century, or maybe in the 18th century, France was the most developed. In the 19th century, Britain was the most developed. In the 20th century, America was the most developed. How does it matter in the 21st century? China will be the most developed. It just keeps on changing, and it doesn't matter. What I'm trying to argue is that phase is over, precisely because of the environmental implications. Because the cumulative emissions have been so high that we cannot keep on having capitalism developing in the same way as it developed. And I've just taken the example of car. Car is symbolic of modern capitalism, because car is not only mode of transport. Around cars there exist a number of ancillary industries through forward and backward linkages. Cars is also linked up with the growth of hotels and motors and tourism industry. And in America at the moment, in 2010 data, there were 797 cars per 1,000 people. And if you look at for adults, it's actually even more than that. In China, it was 58. Now, is it possible that China were to use the same pattern of living as America has? How many cars will be required in China? Just imagine, 1.3 billion people. Okay, if they have the same amount of car used as America, there will not be enough parking space in the world to park those cars. And the amount of waste which will be generated, because each car becomes a waste. And the demand for steel, the demand for rubber, the demand for oil, which will be increased as a result of that. And one can multiply this by taking examples of mobile phones, of computers, of TVs, and so on and so forth. A student of mine actually is doing a PhD with me, and we are just starting on this business. We are going to look at product by product, that if this mode of consumption is duplicated, where it's going to lead to us. And we are trying to say the earth cannot absorb that level of consumption. So in the past, it is fine that capitalism declined in one place, increased in another, but we are trying to say we have reached that point in which the capitalism cannot, because because we have reached a point, either it's capitalism or it's environmental barbarism. And this is a rephrasing of Rosa Luxemburg, who argued socialism or barbarism. And what she meant by this, that if socialism does not replace capitalism, capitalism will lead to inter-imperialist wars. Those inter-imperialist wars will lead to barbarism. What I'm saying is that even without wars, global warming is going to lead to the barbarism. And so this needs a paradigm shift in the advanced capitalist economies. Why need for paradigm shift in the advanced capitalist economies? Because in all the global climate negotiations, when the question comes how to decrease emissions, the developing countries argue that the developed countries are responsible for the emissions, because per capita emissions is much higher than the global in the advanced countries, and it is accumulated emissions which are responsible for global warming, and these accumulated emissions are mainly the responsibility of the developed countries. The developed countries argue that India and China are very, very big. Even if the per capita consumption, per capita emission is higher, but the total emission is much higher because they also need to protect. Now, in a way, that debate is becoming redundant, because India and China are almost reaching the level of advanced countries in terms of per capita emissions. So India and China will not be able to have this argument anymore. But the developing countries have one argument, that is that when the developed countries, the advanced capitalist countries in America and Europe developed, there was no environmental constraint. They could develop as much as they could. And now it is their turn to develop. They are being told that it will destroy the environment. It's like saying that you had a party when you wanted to have, now it is our time to party, and you are telling us that you can't have the party because it's dangerous. I think it's not a global argument. It's a very narrow argument. But developing countries will change their modes of consumption only if there are signs that developed countries are also going to change the model of development. And the recent initiative which Obama has shown, it's a small one, but I think it's very important. In the last few days on the coal industry, the limits which he has imposed bypassing the Congress. I mean, Obama hasn't done very well in many things, but this is one of the good things which I think he has done. So, how does one square up these two things? That developing countries do want to develop, and they need to develop also to reduce poverty, because there are a huge number of people, and one is not talking about thousands and millions, one is talking about billions of people, and they are poor. They have per capita income of less than $1.50, less than $2.50. They don't have any access to house. They have very little clothing. Their food consumption is low. They need to develop, and that's the source. So I'm trying to capture this by this argument of the environmentalists of contraction and convergence. That advanced countries need to recognize that that period of constant growth is over. They need to contract. Therefore, many people, even among the Marxists, who talk about the austerity and austerity is bad in developed countries, I think they're misplaced. I'm pretty good. I'm pretty happy that there's that there's a contraction taking place in advanced countries. They need to recognize that they they need not keep growing. Of course, it requires political leadership. Which political leader has the wisdom and the vision to tell its population that we are not going to have no high economic growth, that during our government per capita income will not increase. But someone will need to come up and do that. But on the other hand, there's need for convergence, that the developing countries, poor countries need to have rise in per capita. Because poverty is also degrading. When people are very, very poor, they cannot afford to bother about environment. Though, in fact, poor people actually care more about the environment, especially when their survival is dependent on the environment. This requires both micro and macro changes. Now, Marxists have normally ignored micro changes, especially individual choices. But I think eco-socialist perspective for the first time is laying emphasis that even micro changes are important. That in your daily life, what you do, whether in your daily life do you do some recycling, whether in your daily life do you do impose certain restraints on consumption, whether in your daily life do you do think about different modes of transport where you can avoid car use, you try to use car use, and so on and so forth, that individual life decisions also will have to change. Of course, institutional changes will need to be brought, and these can be very small ones. I'll give you an example of the initiative I took. In our department, when the meetings take place during lunchtime, we are provided lunch. So in order to give us an incentive that your lunchtime is not being used up, so we are provided lunch, some sandwiches. And then they used to provide bottled water. I suggested at one meeting that why do we need bottled water? Because British water is pretty good and it technically proved to be healthy and we don't need bottled water. And most of my colleagues agreed except one who said that no, I like the taste of bottled water. But he was democratic enough to agree. So we decided that we will not have bottled water. And of course the department was very good, happy that that will decrease their expenditure. Then they said we will multiply this not only to economics department, to all the departments in the School of Business, marketing, management. So they stopped doing bottled water. So the consumption of bottled water increases. So that's one small little thing. Similarly, I proposed that why don't we have organic coffee in a coffee machine and a fair trade coffee, and it was accepted. Now, these are examples of one individual initiative also leading to institutional change. We have been also able to force our university to buy all paper from forests which are sustainable forests. Okay, these are small little things. These are examples of individual decisions, institutional decision, and of course you have to take country-wide decisions for transportation, for energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. So this is where eco-socialist perspective is different from the old classical Marxist thinking, where collective decision making was organized, where global changes were emphasized. Individual decisions were not considered that much important from a historical point of view. I am suggesting that that is also important. It needs to be combined. So this leads me to criticize the orthodox economic theory and some of the green economic theories and of old socialism. And what do I mean by this? It will become hopefully clear in subsequent, but basically what I want to argue is that the orthodox economic theory, the neoliberal economic theory, does not take into account environment, because for them it's a question of efficiency. It's a pure economic efficiency which matters. And criticism of also green economic theory. Most Greens do not bother about the economic logic of the system. They are mainly interested in whether it's sustainable or not. They do not bother about whether it's capitalism or socialism. And many of them are very critical of socialism themselves. Similarly, old socialism. Old socialism was mainly a copy of capitalism. That many old socialists argue that socialism is superior than capitalism because socialism is able to resolve the contradiction which capitalism has. That capitalism has become a factor on the further development of productive forces, and socialism will remove those factors and we will have unlimited development of the productive forces. I am making a criticism of all these theories, and that's what I call eco-socialism. Next. Eco-socialism, in my view, is a conjunction of, and a very creative conjunction, not a mechanical conjunction, but a creative conjunction of ecology and socialism. by which we mean that socialism without ecology results in productivism. That if we do not have ecological dimension in socialism, then socialism is another name for productivism. That increase productivity, increase per capita income, and that's what the worst form of that was Stalinism. And it always comes to my mind a speech of Stalin, which E.H. Carr, who wrote the history of the Bolshevik Revolution, produced in 1930s. Stalin is speaking to industrial managers. He says, comrades, we have to produce in 10 years what the West has done in 100 years. That is what our objective is. The main focus was on increasing industrial production. So that's what socialism was. Even Lenin said, what is socialism? He said electricity, you know, and obviously he was kind of overplaying this. But the main thing was that increasing in productivity is the main basis. So if socialism is not accompanied by ecology, it becomes a productivist ideology, which is not very different from capitalism, because capitalism also, you know, is dependent upon material standards of living, increasing material standards of living, and measuring the quality of life by material standards of living. Similarly, the ecological perspective without socialism does not capture the profit-oriented nature of capitalism, which is essentially nature destroying. So there are ecologists who do not bother about capitalism and socialism. They mainly bother about technology. They think that all technology is environmentally destructive. And they look for industrialization, they disdain, they think that, you know, when people lived on self-sufficient farms, with small agriculture, that wasn't, so they don't look upon capitalism as environmentally destructive. They look upon industrialization as destructive. But I think that's wrong, because with industrialization, we can also develop environmentally compatible technology. But some of the ecologists also think that we can have green capitalism, that it's possible that we can change the behavior of firms and consumers through market mechanisms, that the firms can be made to see that they can make more profit if they produce green products. Similarly, we can use the market mechanism to price products which are green-oriented products to make them cheaper, and people start buying those products. People give the example of non-leaded petrol, that when non-leaded petrol, which is supposed to have environmentally less damaging, was introduced, many people did not buy this. But when the government increased the subsidy, that the non-leaded petrol became cheaper, at least that's the experience of Britain, the consumption of non-leaded petrol increased. And many people give the example of that through market instruments, through market reforms, you can change the behavior of firms, and you can change the behavior of consumers, and you can have sustainability along with capitalism, which they put hopes on green capitalism. And my argument is that there are limits to that. And next line. Okay, now, unlike many other eco-socialists, I am not opposed to green reforms in capitalism. I think it's a good thing that the ecologists or ecological socialists or eco-socialists should argue, along with replacing capitalism by socialism, reforms within capitalism, putting pressure through democratic citizen pressure, to consumer pressure on firms to change their behavior in terms of the inputs which they use, the mode of use of energy they use, the mode of transport which they use. There is a possibility. And my argument is based on this, that if capitalism gets green to some extent, it's good from the viewpoint of eco-socialism, because green capitalism is a better foundation for building green socialism than ungreen capitalism. In a similar way, one can say, I've mentioned the argument of democratic reforms, that many people argue, some traditional Marxists, that it's a bourgeois democracy, there is no democracy under capitalism. And which I think is wrong, because democratic reforms in capitalism are also important, because they strengthen democratic institutions, and democratic institutions have a way of surviving and carrying on. And the example of Soviet Union is very interesting. that socialism came in a country which had very weak democratic tradition. It was a very authoritarian tradition, and so therefore those authoritarian traditions re-emerged under Stalinism. And one can see right from Tsar to Stalin to Putin, there's a continuity between this, because democracy has been weak. So similarly, one would say that as democratic reforms under capitalism are important for building the foundation for democratic socialism, similarly, greening of capitalism is also important. But we also need to recognize the limits. As we recognize the limits of democracy under capitalism, that democracy gets compromised with the rise of corporate powers, and how corporates are able to manage media, people's voting behavior, they are able to sort of spend on advertisements, and therefore only rich people are able to participate in elections and contest in elections, and so therefore limits on having democracy. Similarly, obviously there are clear limits. So eco-socialism is a consistent ecological perspective, visualizing that a true eco-friendly economy and society can be built only by replacing capitalism with a classless society. That there are opportunities and avenues for reform under capitalism, and eco-socialists must fight for that, but eventually that has to be with replacing capitalism with a classless society that one can hope for eco-socialism. And to link up with the main theme, that the rise of BRICS economies is telling us that further development of capitalism is extremely dangerous for humanity. Thank you.
Lá vai o trem sem destino, pro dia novo encontrar. Correndo vai pela terra, vai pela serra, vai pelo